Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for stopping by. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created this Shadowbox card. Now, it's a cool card that folds completely flat to mail, but it pops up when you take it out of the envelope and stands up on its own really nicely. So I just recently have gotten into Pink Fresh's sets of stamps, dies, stencils, and sometimes foiling plates. So I got this set here recently, and I have a set of layering stencils as well as a stamp and the die to cut out that stamp. So we are going to start off with the stamp set, and I'm going to stamp the image onto the cardstock here. Now, I'm just leaving the stamp on the plastic that it comes on. It doesn't really matter if I have a super good stamped image here because I am going to stencil it. It's going to be die cut, so the stamped image is probably not going to be noticed as well. So I ink up my stamp with some permanent ink. I just use some StazOn ink. For what I'm doing here, you can use whatever ink you're wanting. So there is the stamped image, and you can see that it's a little bit lighter in some places, but once I have the stenciling and die cutting in place, you don't even notice those stamped lines. Before I go to stencil my background, I'm going to tape it onto my surface so that it doesn't move around, and I'm also going to tape my stencil down. I'll just keep reusing that stencil tape. I'm going to move through the stencils. There's 4 different stencils here, and the really cool part is they label them 1 through 4 so you know exactly which layer to go next. I am putting the green down for the leaves and the stems, and I try to concentrate the ink at the base of the leaf so that I have some darker and lighter areas. It just looks a little bit more natural that way, in my opinion. I'm taking a darker green here, and I'm doing some more detail on the stems and the leaves in a bit of a darker color. I'm just using distress ink to color in my image. It's a dye-based ink, and it will clean off of my stencils really, really easily. The third stencil, I'm using a pink to do the flowers and the butterfly wings, or parts of the butterfly wings. And then the fourth color I'm going to use is a purple, and that is also going to be on the flowers and the butterfly wings. Now, I could just leave it at like this and only stencil with color and it would look beautiful, but I always love when images have a little bit of texture and dimension to them. So I'm going to take the third stencil and put it back over my piece again, and I have some Perfect Pearls mist that I've created. So I have a mister bottle with water and some Perfect Pearls in it, and I'm just spraying it over, and I let it sit for a little bit so that soaks into the paper before removing my stencil. The fourth stencil I put back on, and I'm using some shimmer paste. So that is some glitter glue that is in a pot, and I lift that stencil off so that I can clean both my stencil and the palette knife right away. You don't want to leave that stuff on your stencil or your palette knife to dry because it's going to be really difficult to take off. So clean it off as soon as you can. Once those are completely dry, and I let mine dry overnight, I'm taking the die and I'm lining it up with the stamped image. I like to tape it in place really, really well, so when I put it through my die cutting machine, there's no chance of it shifting. So I have a Big Shot machine here that I have had for many, many, many years. I love it, and I'm die cutting my image through it. Once it is out, I take that piece out of the die and remove all the die cuts. Now, it takes a little bit to take some of these die cuts out because there's a lot of nooks and crannies and stems and leaves, but it came out really, really nicely. And bonus, I ended up having 4 butterflies. I thought there was only 3 with this, but I have 4 there. So I'm going to tuck those over to the side and save them for later. And the die cut image looks absolutely beautiful. I decided to use this Spellbinder set that I've had for years, and I actually haven't used it yet. Shame on me. And I'm going to use that for the window of the card. For the base of the card, I have 2 pieces of Nina Classic Crest cover stock that I'm using, and I'm scoring at a 1/2 inch and a 1 inch from the edge on the 2 opposite sides. So those 2 sides, I'm going to take those scored edges and I'm going to accordion fold them. And I'm using a bone folder to make sure that I get a really nice crisp score line there. I want to make sure that it's nice and crisp before I go and glue my cards together. And if you notice on the side of that one there, it scored a little bit wonky, so I'm just going to fix that right now. Best to fix it before you glue anything together, because once you glue it together, you can't fix anything. Now this Nina cardstock is fabulous for the base because it's really nice and thick and sturdy, so it's going to support the whole card really, really well. I will list all the supplies as well as the measurements for scoring and cutting in the description below. So if there's anything you're wanting to know, you'll likely see that information down below if I've forgotten to say it. Once I have my background completely scored and have those scores in place, I'm taking the die that I want to use for my window and I'm taping it in the center of the card front. Now I do have to fold in a couple of those side flaps so that it fits in my die cutting machine, but once it's out of the machine, I can put those scores back in there. And I'm using a fancier rectangle, but you could use a plain rectangle set as well. So now that I have my window on my card, I'm just laying things out to see how they're looking on the front of the card. And I decided I wanted to add a purple frame around that window. Now this Spellbinder set has several different dies that you can use. You can pick and choose whichever ones you want to use. So I have the window that I use for the frame on the center of this piece here, plus a decorative place, plus an outer piece to cut the edge of that out. I'm taping it firmly on some light purple cardstock. I didn't want this frame to overtake the die cut image, but I wanted to kind of enhance some of those colors. Now what I was pointing out there is the two ends of this didn't really cut as well, so I'm to put a cardstock shim underneath my plate and then I ran it back through my machine, and you can see with that extra pressure those pieces are now cut through. So I can take that out of the die cut and remove all of those little bits and pieces. I like to reuse my die tape several times. Most of the time it sticks for several uses and might as well keep using it and not waste it. So I have a little thing on the side that I put the die tape to reuse. Now that I have the inside and the outside out, I'm using a Spellbinder's tool-in-one to take all the pieces out here. I typically will do this right over the garbage can so I don't have little bits and pieces scattered all over my surface. So once I have it outside of the die, the tool-in-one that brush doesn't really take those pieces out as well. So I'll take a die pick and poke some of those pieces out. There is a die pick end to the tool-in-one, but I tend not to use it. I tend to just use the die pick that I already have. It's just a little bit easier to grab, but if you didn't already have one, there is one that's included when you get a Spellbinder's tool-in-one. Once all of those pieces are out, I'm using some Distress Collage medium to glue that frame onto the front of my card. I like using the Distress Collage medium because it dries completely clear and it dries matte. So if by chance some happens to seep out, you're never going to see that it was there. I put some acrylic blocks on my pieces when I want them to dry so that my hands are free to work on other things, and I know that the paper is not going to flip up or warp or anything while it's drying. Once that frame is completely dry, I'm taking my die cut and I'm gluing it to the front of the frame. So I've got the end of the stem underneath the top part of the frame there, and the rest of it is coming out and going over the front of the frame. I just thought it looks a little bit more interesting that way rather than having it all, say, underneath that frame. That way you're not missing some of those beautiful leaves and flowers. So I glued some of the back ends of the pieces on the front, and then once that was dry, I glued the pieces that were stuck behind the frame just to make sure that everything was secure in place before moving on and gluing my card together. I'm also going to glue those butterflies on, but you could wait until afterwards if you wanted to glue them on afterwards. Now, the two full butterflies, I want to have them kind of floating in behind, almost so that it's like they're flying in the scene, and it's going to give it a little bit of movement as that card opens. So I have some pieces of scrap acrylic here that I'm just gluing the butterflies to the end of. I just have some double-sided tape here that is going to hold them really, really well to those acrylic pieces. Now, these are just scraps from some acetate that I've used in card making. You could also use in scrap packaging. A lot of things come in some nice thick acrylic or acetate, and you can use it for that. So before my card is put together, I'm placing that butterfly where I want it to go, and then I cut off the excess acetate so I know how long that piece is supposed to be. I'll put some more of that double-sided tape on the end of that acetate. I accidentally put it on the wrong side of the acetate, so I have some tape exposed, but it's going to be completely covered when I put my card together, so no harm done if you happen to do that as well. The funny thing is I actually do it the second time as well. The second time I think I'm being so careful and placing it on the right side, and I place it on the wrong side, so I have to put another piece on. But I measured the length for that piece in exactly the same way as I measured the first one. The only thing different is one I have coming out of the right side of the card, the other one is on the left side of the card. And those are two places that are openings on that die cut. So I wanted to be able to see it. I didn't want that die cut hiding those pieces. And by having those open places and filling them in there, it just worked out perfectly. So that same double-sided tape, I like to use Sukwang. It's very easy to put on and it sticks really, really well. So I put a strip on each of those side 1/2 inch scored pieces. And then I'm taking my back of my card and I'm going to glue the front to the back, gluing those two flaps together. Now for the first side, I took the entire backing off of that tape and glued those two pieces together. I had a little piece of acetate sticking out, so I just trimmed that off. For the second one, if you're not comfortable doing that entire piece all at once, here's how to do it. Just take some of the backing off of the tape, have it flipping out, and then just glue a little bit together at a time and pull the excess backing out as you're comfortable. Now that we have the full card together, I'm going to put those 2 half butterflies on the front piece and let that glue sit and dry. And you want to make sure that it's completely dry before moving on to the next step. Now, when I first thought of this card in my head, I didn't really think about putting a sentiment on the front. I thought there wasn't going to be any space for it. But as I'm looking at it, it just seems a little bit plain. The other thing is I hadn't intended on putting something in the center, but I wanted those butterflies and the stems to really pop, and I found having a white background there wasn't quite cutting it. So I have a piece of blue here that I had pre-cut in my card mat stash, and I just popped it in there. You could take a piece of blue that was the full size of the card. This one isn't, it just covers that window, but it does the job nicely. So I'm going to glue that in there and let that completely dry. Now that that is dry, we are ready to start creating the sentiment for the card. And you'll see that I keep testing the card as I'm working on it. I just want to make sure that things are working as intended. So I have this sentiment here that I'm going to foil. It just says hello, and then the small sentiment says hello, my sweet friend, or hello, sweet friend. I'm going to cut off the hello part of it so I don't have that doubled. But I do want to foil the complete sentiment because I'm going to foil both the positive and the negative. I'm not sure which part I'm going to use yet, but I want to make sure those sentiments are complete. Now I have a little scrap box that you just saw there. I put all my scraps in there. They're small enough to do some of those small sentiments, and every once in a while I'll just do a sheet of some small sentiments to use up some of those scraps. If you've never used a glimmer machine, I have a few videos on here using it, so you can check those out to see exactly how it's used. Basically, you warm up your whole platform. Once the button or the light shows that the platform is ready, you put your cardstock with the foil plates and the foil on it and the plates on top. Push the button to heat it up for the amount of time that it's supposed to, and then I run it through my Big Shot machine for the pressure. So you do need the heat and you need the pressure. So I'm taking the foiling plates as well as the tape off of that backing there, and I'm going to foil the negative part of this. I have a solid foil plate that does this, so I put it on the machine for the amount of time, and then I'm going to put it through my Big Shot machine for the pressure and remove the foil there. I love how this solid hot foil plate gives you both the positive and the negative of an image. When foiling first came out, I never wanted to do it because of the fact that I thought it was such a waste having all that excess foil. And now that a solid plate is a thing, I love the fact that you're not going to have all that excess. Now my small sentiments here has a die, a banner die, that you can use to cut them out. I'm not using it for this. I'm just using a little mini trimmer because I want to cut that hello part off anyways, so I wouldn't have a complete sentiment anyways. But if you were planning on using the entire thing, you could just use the die that comes with that set there. And then my hello die has a die cut that cuts the whole foil sentiment out. The foil that I'm using is a satin foil. So it's a really pretty pink that has a satin finish to it, and it works beautifully with the colors of the flowers on this card. Now that both the positive and the negative pieces are cut, I can choose which one I want to use on the front of my card. So I decided to use the positive for the hello and then the negative for the sweet friend. I just liked the solid pink around it and the white letters. My excess sentiments, I have a little container that I keep them in so that it makes it really easy when I'm card making just to be able to pop out a sentiment so I don't have to stop and foil each and every single time. It's just a little convenient thing there to have them all ready to go. Once I have them picked, I'm just going to use my Distress Collage medium and I'm going to glue them in place and let them sit to dry. I do put an acrylic block on there while they are drying just to hold them in place. I want to make sure that it is going to stay exactly where I place it. I like the fact that a liquid glue lets you have a little bit of wiggle room. You can shimmy things in place, you can move it. If I happen to put it down a little bit crooked, I can straighten it out. It's just a little bit convenient that way. And for a sentiment this small, as well as a die cut behind it, putting tape on, it would be pretty hard to be precise with that, whereas a liquid glue with a fine tip, you could be as precise as you need to be. Once that glue has dried, the card is complete. Again, it folds totally flat to be able to mail it. This ends up being a 5x7 card, so you'll need an envelope for a 5x7 card if you plan on mailing it out. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.